There are actors who chase fame, and then there are actors who seem almost reluctant to carry it. Men who step into the spotlight not because they need the applause, but because something deep inside compels them to tell human stories. Richard Gere has always belonged to that second category. For more than 5 decades, he has moved through Hollywood with a kind of quiet elegance that is increasingly rare in an industry built on noise. He made women fall in love with him in Pretty Woman. He made men want to be him in American Gigolo. He danced his way into Oscar glory in Chicago. And through it all, he somehow managed to remain a man of genuine substance beneath the glamour. A Buddhist, a humanitarian, a father, a philosopher in a profession not known for producing many. But at 75, the picture that emerges when you look closely at Richard Gere's life is not simply the portrait of a celebrated actor enjoying a graceful twilight. It is something far more complicated. It is a portrait of a man who has weathered losses that would have broken someone less grounded, someone who didn't have decades of spiritual practice to draw upon. It is a story of love found and lost, of health scares that came without warning, of grief arriving in waves, and of a Hollywood system that doesn't always know what to do with its legends once the box office numbers begin to fade. And for those who have followed his journey, not just the red carpets and premieres, but the real moments in between, the truth of where Richard Gere stands today feels, in many ways, profoundly heartbreaking. To understand what Richard Gere is facing now, you have to understand where he came from, not the polished version offered in press junkets, but the quieter, more vulnerable truth of his early years. Born on August 31st, 1949, in Philadelphia and raised in upstate New York, Gere grew up in a household that valued modesty, discipline, and faith. His parents, Homer and Doris Gere, were devoted and grounded people who raised their 5 children with a strong moral compass and a clear sense of right and wrong. On the surface, it appeared to be a perfectly ordinary American upbringing. But beneath it, for young Richard, something far more restless was quietly taking root. Even as a teenager, those who knew him described a young man who seemed to be wrestling with questions that most people his age hadn't yet thought to ask. He excelled academically, showed real talent in music, particularly the trumpet, and demonstrated a natural and undeniable ability in theater and performance. But none of it quieted the inner agitation that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He has spoken in various interviews over the years about a profound sense of loneliness that accompanied his adolescence. Not the kind born from social rejection or being unpopular, but something deeper and far more philosophical. A feeling of being spiritually unmoored, of looking at the world around him and sensing that the life being offered simply didn't match something essential he felt burning inside. That restlessness followed him into adulthood and into the competitive, often brutal world of theater and early film. Acting gave him a canvas, but it did not give him peace. It wasn't until his 20s, when he first encountered Buddhist philosophy and began practicing meditation seriously, that something began to genuinely settle within him. His introduction to Tibetan Buddhism would prove to be one of the most defining chapters of his entire life. Not a publicity move, not a passing spiritual phase, but a real and lasting transformation that would color every decision he made from that point forward. He eventually developed a close and enduring friendship with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, becoming one of the most visible and vocal Western advocates for Tibetan human rights at a time, when doing so carried very real professional consequences. Hollywood studios with significant financial interests in the Chinese market made their displeasure known. Richard Gere refused to back down. That single fact tells you nearly everything you need to know about who this man truly is. By the early 1990s, Richard Gere was arguably the most charismatic leading man working in Hollywood. Pretty Woman had transformed him from a respected actor into a global superstar, and when he married supermodel Cindy Crawford in December 1991, the world treated the union like the coming together of royalty. Tabloids could not print photographs of them fast enough. Here was the most magnetic actor in American cinema, marrying one of the most recognized faces in international fashion. It looked, from the outside, like a perfect story. But celebrity marriages constructed in the glare of constant flashbulbs rarely manage to thrive in the quiet of ordinary daily life. And this one was no exception. Behind the glossy magazine covers and the carefully managed public appearances, the relationship faced pressures that no amount of shared charm or beauty could dissolve over time. Their 17-year age gap was a recurring subject of public discussion and tabloid commentary. Their careers pulled them in fundamentally opposing directions. Gere toward his films and his deepening activism, Crawford toward an international modeling career that demanded its own relentless and exhausting schedule. Privacy, for two people that famous in that particular era, was essentially impossible to find or protect. And without the space to simply exist as two private human beings, working to the ordinary difficulties that every relationship requires, the marriage began to quietly fracture from within. By 1995, after less than 4 years together, the divorce was finalized. No children had been born from the union, but the emotional cost was real and genuinely significant. For a man who valued depth and authentic spiritual connection above almost everything else, the dissolution of marriage, regardless of its complicated public dimensions, was a genuine wound that required time and real inner work to process. He faced it, as he has faced most difficult things in his life, largely in silence and away from the cameras. That restraint has always been one of his most admirable qualities, but it has also meant that very few people have ever truly understood the private toll that particular chapter took on him. Love returned for Richard Gere in the form of Carrie Lowell, an actress and former model whom he began dating seriously in the late 1990s. Their relationship felt different from the beginning. Quieter, more deliberate, shaped by two people who had both learned something important from previous chapters of their lives. They welcomed a son, Homer James Jigme Gere, in February 2000, and Gere has described the arrival of his child as one of the most profoundly meaningful moments he has ever experienced. They married in 2002, and for a period of years, the picture seemed genuinely settled. Here was a man in his 50s who appeared to have found real partnership, who was raising a son he clearly adored, and who was balancing meaningful film work with his ongoing humanitarian commitments. But relationships are living things, and they do not always survive the various pressures placed upon them over time, even when both people involved are fundamentally decent human beings. By September 2013, news emerged that Gere and Lowell had quietly separated. Those familiar with the situation described a growing incompatibility in temperament and fundamental approach to life. Gere, ever the introspective and spiritually oriented contemplative, existed in a world organized around meditation, purposeful activism, and deep inner reflection. The differences, whatever their precise nature, had grown too wide to bridge, and what followed was not a clean or swift resolution. The divorce proceedings stretched across nearly 3 years, finally concluding in October 2016, involving complex negotiations over shared assets, significant real estate holdings, and arrangements concerning their teenage son. For a man who had already endured one very public marital dissolution decades earlier, navigating a second through the still invasive lens of celebrity media in the digital age was its own particular and prolonged exhaustion. In the very same year that his second divorce was being finalized, Richard Gere suffered a loss that no legal settlement or financial negotiation could ever prepare a person to face. In July 2016, his mother, Doris Gere, passed away at the age of 91. She had lived a genuinely long and full life, and by any reasonable measure, 91 years represents a life well and truly completed. But the loss of a mother cannot be rationalized away by pointing to life expectancy or the fullness of years lived. For Gere, whose entire emotional foundation had been shaped in large part by the steady, patient, and unconditionally loving presence of his parents, the death of his mother arrived at one of the most turbulent periods of his adult life, and its weight was enormous. He was in the final stages of a drawn-out divorce. He was in his mid-60s. And suddenly, the person who had known him longer than anyone else alive, who had watched him grow from a restless, searching boy in upstate New York into a man of genuine global influence and purpose, was simply gone. The comfort that a parent provides, even when you are yourself a figure of significant age and accomplishment, is entirely irreplaceable. It is the one relationship in a human life that carries no conditions, no complications, and no possibility of renegotiation. When it ends, a certain kind of shelter disappears from the world permanently and without ceremony. Then in February 2023, while on a family vacation in Mexico, the body sent a message that no amount of mindful living or careful discipline could prevent. What began as a respiratory illness, the kind that can seem manageable for the first day or two before revealing its true severity, escalated rapidly into a serious case of pneumonia. Gere, who was 73 years old at the time, required hospitalization. For a man who had spent decades maintaining his physical health with genuine commitment and consistency, the sudden and dramatic loss of control over his own body must have been deeply disorienting. Pneumonia in a person's 70s is not a minor inconvenience or a brief setback. It is a genuine medical crisis that demands intensive treatment and carries the very real possibility of dangerous complications if not addressed with speed and care. Reports confirmed that other members of his family were also unwell during the trip. But Gere's case proved to be the most serious and required the most intensive medical attention. He was hospitalized for several days, monitored carefully, and treated before eventually being discharged to complete his recovery. When news of the hospitalization became public, it reverberated around the world in a way that revealed just how deeply and genuinely invested people remain in his well-being. Millions of fans who had grown up watching him across 5 decades suddenly confronted the reality that the man they had long thought of as somehow timeless was 73 years old, lying in a hospital bed far from home, fighting an illness that could easily have turned far more serious. He recovered, but the experience left a mark that could not simply be set aside. Then came March 2023, just weeks after being discharged from that Mexican hospital. Still in the process of slowly rebuilding his strength and his energy, Richard Gere received the news that his father, Homer George Gere, had passed away at the extraordinary age of 100, a centennial life, 100 full years of memory, experience, relationship, and presence completed. Homer Gere had been a steady and deeply principled man throughout his long life, one who modeled for his son what it genuinely meant to move through the world with integrity and quiet purpose. The values that Richard Gere has demonstrated so consistently over the course of his public life, his willingness to stand up for the bed at significant professional cost, his long-running work on humanitarian causes, his genuine and unperformed humility in a profession that actively breeds self-absorption, all of these trace back, in meaningful part, to what he absorbed from watching his father live. The timing of Homer's death was particularly devastating in its proximity to Gere's own health crisis. He had barely recovered, had barely regained his physical footing, when life asked him to grieve again. Grief has a way of compounding, of reopening wounds that were only beginning to close and making everything feel freshly and acutely raw. To lose a parent is always significant, regardless of their age or the fullness of the life they lived. But to lose your last surviving parent is to become, in a very particular and irreversible sense, an elder in your own right. The generational buffer above you disappears entirely. And when you are already 73, already grappling with your own mortality in immediate aftermath of a serious illness, that realization lands with its full and undiminished weight. There is another dimension to Richard Gere's story at 75 that deserves to be addressed honestly, because Hollywood tends to allow its aging legends to fade quietly rather than examine the structural reasons behind their disappearance. Gere was once among the most bankable stars in American cinema. Pretty Woman remains one of the highest-grossing romantic comedies in the history of film. His performance in Chicago demonstrated conclusively that his gifts had deepened and matured rather than diminished with the passing years. And yet, as the 2010s progressed, the roles made available to him contracted in both scale and cultural significance. This is not unique to him. Hollywood has always had a complicated and frequently unkind relationship with its male stars once they pass a certain age. But for someone who was once genuinely central to American cinema, the contraction is notable and carries its own particular sadness. He has continued working. The television series Mother, Father, Son in 2019 and the film O, Canada in 2024 reflect his sustained commitment to the craft and his refusal to simply withdraw. But the scale of the platform no longer matches the scale of his talent or his legacy, and that gap between what a person is capable of and what the world chooses to ask them is its own quiet grief. It would be a fundamental distortion, however, to tell Richard Gere's story at 75 as if it were only a chronicle of accumulating loss, because it genuinely is not. In 2018, at the age of 68, he married Alejandra Silva, a Spanish activist who was 33 at the time. Their relationship had developed quietly and authentically, built on shared values around humanitarian work and spiritual life rather than on the electricity of celebrity. In April 2019, they welcomed a son, Gere's second child, born when he was 69 years old. A second son followed in 2020. The image of Richard Gere beginning a new chapter of fatherhood in his late 60s, holding newborn children while most men his age are becoming grandparents, is genuinely and deeply moving. He has described this relationship as the most grounded and peaceful love he has known. But even this beautiful chapter carries its own particular weight. To be 75 and the father of young children is to hold tremendous joy and quiet awareness simultaneously. The awareness that time is finite, that the arithmetic of age is simply what it is, that your children may face a loss earlier than the children of younger fathers. He carries both the joy and that awareness together, without apparent bitterness, which is itself a form of grace that very few people manage. At 75, Richard Gere has buried both his parents, survived 2 divorces, endured a serious health crisis, watched an industry that once placed him at its center gradually move on, and done all of it while raising children, sustaining a marriage, and continuing to show up for the causes that have defined his public conscience for decades. He has done this mostly without complaint and almost entirely without drama, which in the current media environment is its own quietly radical act. The tragedy of Richard Gere at 75 is not that he has collapsed under the weight of what life has handed him. It is that so much has been asked of him, by grief, by loss, by illness, by time, and that he has met every single demand of it with a dignity that most of us, if we are honest, can only admire from a distance. It is a particular heartbreak of watching someone who has given genuinely and consistently to his art, to his beliefs, and to the world, face the accumulated weight of 7.5 decades with grace rather than bitterness. Some stories do not have easy resolutions. Some lives, even remarkable ones, are simply long and full and complicated and real. Richard Gere's is all of those things.